Welcome back. The American Revolution, as you know, has been a hot topic in pulp culture, particularly since Hamilton became such a smash hit on Broadway. Now there's renewed interest in both historical fiction and nonfiction, particularly when it comes to the Revolution. A new book mixes both, as it is historical fiction. It's called Saving Washington, the forgotten story of the Maryland 400 and the Battle of Brooklyn. I recently sat down with its author, Chris Formant. So, Chris, I think most people realize that the Revolutionary War went through New York, and a lot of people have heard of the Battle of Brooklyn, but I'll admit until I got your book, I'd never heard of the Maryland 400. Who were they, and what made it so desirable for you to write about them?
Well, I didn't know about this either. You know, I had heard of the battle, but I had no clue. I heard about it and discovered it in a very serendipitous way. I live in Baltimore. And I was reading the Baltimore Sun, and I came across a little one-paragraph announcement announcing a wreath-laying ceremony in Prospect Park, Brooklyn. And it was honoring the bravery and heroism of the Maryland 400, and it was captioned, "The Maryland 400 Who Saved America." I'd never heard of this before. So I did what you would do or anybody else would do. I immediately Googled Maryland 400, and this whole story was exposed to me. And I sort of followed it. I got sort of hooked on it and started researching it a little bit more. I had never written a historical fiction novel in my life. I loved reading them. But this whole story was illuminated of these 400 brave young men that saved George Washington and the Continental Army from imminent disaster 6 weeks after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And I discovered that if it was not for their heroism, for their suicide mission, if you will, that the revolution could have been over that day.
And I'll leave the details of their actions to your readers. I don't want to give too much away, but it's interesting. The Maryland 400, most people look back at the revolutionary times and they assume that there was still racial division, you know, blacks separated from whites, but the Maryland 400 was an integrated group, correct?
Well, it's sort of counterintuitive to what people have been taught, or maybe it's never really been written about. But the Revolutionary War, this is a surprise to me. The Revolutionary War we had the most integrated war roster, not cooks, or these are actual, combatants. We had the most integrated war roster up until the Korean War. And apparently from, revolutionary times through around 1840 or 1850, it was an integrated war force. And so about 5 or 6% of the whole Continental Army were either free or black slaves that fought for them. I was surprised. So, when I started to think about how I would characterize and write about something where there was just a paltry amount of information about it, I had to write a fiction because I was going to have to develop a story around some of the few facts that were there. And I thought it would be illuminating if I had the two main characters, a white kid and a black kid.
So I'm sorry, were the Maryland 400 themselves integrated, or are they just integrated in your retelling of the tale using historical fiction?
No. Not quite sure about the Maryland 400, how integrated they were, but Smallwood's regiment, which was the Maryland, the 1st Maryland Regiment, had about 5% blacks fighting throughout the Revolutionary War. And that was about the same as most states.
Okay. I'm curious because your first book was a rock and roll thriller. Now you're going to historic fiction. I'm curious why that technique, and what were the challenges for you as you're sort of combining a historic event that you want to highlight and share with other people with, a story of your own invention to sort of humanize or put faces to them?
I like to tell stories. And so, I'm probably doing something that my agent would tell me not to do, which is, or any other authors who try to stay within a certain genre. I like to tell stories. And it just so happened the first one was a rock and roll murder mystery. This one I got hooked on this forgotten piece of history, and it just infected me, and I had to write about it. And so the more I got into it, the more that I tried to get into the characters, to understand the environment, to understand the emotions. And so what ended up coming out, it actually educated me quite a bit, because I found that their motivations were not what I was taught in school. At the end of the day, teenagers fight wars. Young people fight wars. And I thought to myself, there isn't a teenager in the world that's going to go on a suicide mission for taxes. There has to be something more here. And that's what I tried to illuminate in Saving Washington.
Finally, Chris, I keep thinking of the show Hamilton when thinking about the Revolution. And in the show, they say that Hamilton was the forgotten founding father. He is clearly forgotten no more. Is your hope that by telling the story of the Maryland 400 that you raise their profile, get more people to find out about them, and sort of make them unforgotten in the same way?
Absolutely. Up until about, at the time of this event that saved Washington and the Continental Army, it electrified the colonies, and it was compared to the Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae. And up until about 100 years after the event, it had been captioned in the history books as, one writer called it, the most precious hour in American history. And that was in the 1860s. Since then, it was kind of lost. And so, when I was doing my research, it took me to the Army War College. And I was trying to solicit their help, because they have archives like no one else. And they have a museum dedicated to citizen soldiers. And I was speaking with some highly decorated military leaders. And I said, General, and his staff, I said, these may be the most important yet most forgotten citizen soldiers in the history of the United States. And he goes, yeah, that's true. And I said, you know what the saddest part of all this is? Not that we don't recognize them as the heroes that they were, but that these forgotten heroes are scattered under the streets of Brooklyn. And he started tearing up, and he said, Chris, whatever help you need, we'll give it to you to get the story out.
And if that's not an invitation to get into this book, I don't know what would be. Chris Formant is the author of Saving Washington, the forgotten story of the Maryland 400 and the Battle of Brooklyn. Chris, thanks for a few minutes. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for allowing me to tell the story.
We'll be back to wrap up RFL right after this.